Okay, so let's see if we're recording. Check. Okay, so what I want to do today is primarily just go over most of the assignments that you need to do for Dragon Week, just to maybe help you out a bit about how you can understand the assignments better and why I actually give you those assignments. That's important too. Um, and just give you some tips and things you can look out for to help you just better understand construction in general, because this will apply to any subject really, especially organic subjects. And the thing with dragons, of course, is that it's a very complicated subject. So I do hope you guys are taking what I said about the limitations to heart. Just keep it to one or two animals and really learn those. And I'll definitely give you some advice on that in the animal study day. But for the first day, what we have is basically what I want you to do is two things, right? It's the manipulation one, which is bend, inflate, and taper, and then manipulation two is contour manipulation. So one feeds into the other, and that's actually what I wanted to discuss today. So if we look at manipulation one, is I primarily want you guys to bend, inflate, and taper simple primitives, and primarily boxes and cylinders, right? So if we have a simple cylinder like this, what we are now going to do is we're going to manipulate it. And if we just bend it, right, we get something that maybe just looks like this. Fairly simple. And if we inflate it, then it looks more like this. And if we taper it, it looks more like this. Right. And so now the exercise for you guys will be to see if you can do multiple of these manipulations in one object. And that's important. And I think there are a couple of things that you can take into consideration when you're doing this. One is, of course, thinking about your center line, right? So if we think about, and again, for those of you who are not familiar with drawing cylinders, please check the cylinder tutorial on the Fundamental website, because that's going to be important. So if we think about the minor axis that runs through all our cylinders, we can definitely, or that can definitely be of use when we're bending our simple shape, right? Because instead of it just being straight, our minor axis is just bending along with our object, right? So it's going in here and coming out the end. Now, of course, with the inflation and the taper, that's not the case because the minor axis just stays the same on both of them. But what's important with the inflation and the taper is our contours, right? And that's why I said that manipulation one feeds into manipulation two, because if you can understand how contours are manipulated in these simple exercises, then you'll have a better time understanding it in manipulation two, right? So what basically happens with these simple inflations is that instead of having this contour line, we're inflating, or we're enlarging part of the contour, of that cylinder, right? And with the taper, we're doing the reverse, right? We're making the contour smaller. And so now it becomes an exercise of combining those manipulations, right? So if we, for instance, have a tapered bent cylinder, what we can think about is our bent minor axis, and then our first contour, and then maybe a smaller contour, like this, and an even smaller one. And then if we connect those, just going to turn my screen. We get that resulting bent tapered cylinder. Okay, and that's basically how I would advise you guys to think about these manipulated forms. And then it's, of course, it's up to you to start making things a little bit more complicated. And I advise you to make things more complicated in the simplest objects at the simplest day, right? Which is day one. Because, and I definitely see this in the manipulation 2 exercise of day 2 already with some of the submissions, is that you guys are just looking at what I provided in the instructional video, and you maybe do slight variations on those and then call it done, right? But that's not the point of the exercises that I'm giving you. I'm giving you these exercises to start think for yourself, and especially design for yourself. That's the most important part. So with those manipulations, you need to start being creative. After all, most of you in here want to become designers. So try to be creative with these manipulation exercises to come up with interesting looking designs instead of just copying what I do in the instructional video. The instructional video is just, like the word said, it's just to be instructional and to give you an example of what you can do. But it's up to you to be creative with those exercises. Because, to put it harshly, if you cannot make an interesting simple shape in day 1, don't bother making a cool dragon in day 3, right? You should train and like this is for the opportunity for you to train your design skills and whatever in day 1. All right. So moving on with, again, the boxes is basically the same thing. It's also thinking about contours, right? So if we have, for instance, a bent box like this, right? I'm going to keep it simple today. Right. So we can bend the box, but we could also twist the box. That's pretty interesting with boxes. And so that's definitely something I would advise you to try and do this week as well with the simple shapes. Try to twist the boxes as well, and then try to make a twisted bent box and things like that. So a good thing what I find with, especially with twisting boxes, is that you think about and I'm gonna draw through the form for now. Let's do that in red. Think about the top plane and the bottom plane of where that box will end. So this is my top plane, and then maybe my bottom plane will look like this. And then, we can start connecting that shape. Like this. So thinking about that, you can make it maybe a little easier for yourself to draw these twisted forms. And also, especially tapering for the boxes is going to be an interesting exercise for you to do this week, because that's basically what the most rudimentary shape of our dragon is. It's a tapered box most of the time, right? There are a lot of exceptions, of course, but if we think about it, our dragon head almost looks like a tapered box, like this. And again, this is the simplest form of that tapered box, but you can make it more interesting, right? You can make it more appealing. You can also, instead of, and this is a bit more thinking like a modeler, or a sculptor, is that you can also manipulate not only the contours like this, right? These are the contours, and if we draw through them, they look like this. But we can also just manipulate some of the, what they would call in 3D, the vertices, right? Which is just the lines. And what I could do was, instead of them being straight lines, I could bend them, right? And then you could argue, okay, what would that resulting shape look like? And this is how you can add interest into your, dragon designs as well. So for instance, instead of that tapered box just looking like that, I can make it maybe look like this, right? Or I could first have it go straight down, connect with my contour, and then manipulate those simple shapes. Does that make sense? And if I'm going too fast, please let me know. All right. Okay, and so then going into manipulation 2, day 1. This is, the hard version of the manipulation 1, because we're basically still doing everything from the first manipulation. However, instead of the contours being very simple, like a circle or a square, or even a triangle, which is already a little bit manipulated, we are now going to manipulate the contour itself. And this is where I find you should spend a lot of the time this week, because this is where you can really, really practice your design skills. So instead of just having, what actually would be considered quite a boring shape, overall, is that how can we manipulate all these contours that are running through that form to basically come up with a new form, right? And so if we do that and we maybe create something like this, like what would that resulting shape look like? Right? This is the things that you should consider. And then to make it easier on yourself, and just for all you guys, we're only doing parts of organic shapes. We're not drawing complete creatures or whatever, right? So you can start with that, that cut through, that contour. You can start by first defining where it's going to sit in space, right? So you can draw a bounding box if you want to, and then you're going to, design that resulting shape, and then you're going to see like, okay, how does this look when I do something like this? And what you can also think about, what I was saying earlier about that minor axis for the cylinder, that's basically what you can think about with your design as well. Like, there would still be a minor axis for this manipulated shape or manipulated contour. So you could have it, go any way you like. And then you could think about what the contour is doing and what manipulations are you applying to the contour. So is it going to be continually like the same shape all over, same size, but just different orientation, which you could do, but then everything looks pretty boring, right? So you could argue like, okay, is this going to be like a dragon tail then the contour is probably going to taper as well. So, that's what you do. You change the orientation and you change the taper. So that might result in, looking and something that might look like this. It's not going to be perfect. And so as you can see, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to taper and change the orientation of that contour line at the same time. And then, always thinking about how that manipulated contour that I drew in the beginning, how that is going to affect what my shape looks like. Right. But you shouldn't only restrict yourself to, tails or manipulated cylinders. A really good animal even to look at in real life, and this is actually what I would suggest that you do. Look at things like squids, for instance. Squids have those tentacles. Those tentacles are basically cylinders that have been tapered and bent, and then the contour has been manipulated, right? But also the same for like ram horns, for instance. If we look at a ram horn or a goat horn, or let's say a ram horn, I'm just gonna move this aside. I'm first gonna draw the horn. Basically a goat horn, and I'm guessing this, but from what I've drawn already, most of the horns usually look something like this, right? And basically what happens with those horns is that they have, and their contour looks a little bit like a triangle, like this. And so that's actually also just a manipulated contour line. Right, and this area would probably be a little flatter. Right, and then they sit on the skull. So that's something that you can also look at, like real life reference, and figure out for yourself how the manipulations that I've been telling you in this week, how they apply to those real life objects, right? And it could be other objects as well, but try to keep it organic, especially try to keep it dragon related. So look at horns, tentacles, snake bodies, right? These are really good things to look at, and just figure out for yourself, like, okay, how has this contour been manipulated? Is the body tapering? Is it bending? Is it twisting? Stuff like that. And then it becomes, and that's why I want you to take the most time with this assignment, particularly, is because this is a great opportunity for you guys to start learning to design interesting shapes. Because designing interesting shapes it's all that matters almost these days in entertainment design, right? Especially if you want to be a concept designer. because that just creates interesting silhouettes and interesting designs. And I think just open up your favorite concept art books, things like Overwatch, great example again, and just see how they use that simple principle of bending, twisting, manipulating contours to come up with interesting shapes. Instead of it just being normal horns, you could maybe have horns that do something like this maybe. And that looks a little bit more entertaining, right? And then you could think, well, I was already thinking about it when I drew it, but these are sort of like the contour lines of which this object exists, right? And then you can give it volume. And it's also good to know about these contour lines because it makes it easier for shading as well, or just for adding detail, right? In a believable fashion. Because if you say, for instance, I'm going to add little horns to this, you can do it on each half of those contours and it will look it will look better because you're following that contour, right? And then you can still apply the big, medium, small rule. That's up to you. Let's just draw one more. I think a good example, and I have a reference, I think, here. Let me just quickly find it. All right, here we go. So, when I ask most of you guys to draw me a wizard hat, what most of you will do is boom, wizard hat, right? But that doesn't look really entertaining. Not for today's standards, at least. Right? So what you see a lot of artists do now is make those shapes more interesting. And it's basically with that principle of course, good design sense, but also the manipulation of shapes. So instead of it looking like this, it might, look like this a little bit, and then that shape will do something like this, and then maybe go back, and then go like this, right? And this will probably be a little bigger. Right? So and you can make it more squarish if you want to, just to add another layer of interest. Right? And that's how you can make that simple wizard hat, a little bit more interesting. Does that make sense? Okay. Good. All right, now let's go into the assignment for day 2. And so in day 2, what I'm asking of you guys is to study the animal that you're going to pick for your dragon this week. So whether that's a crocodile like I'm doing, it's more like a caiman, I think. Whether that's a crocodile, a lizard of some type, a snake, just a bat, anything anything. You can basically make a dragon out of any animal, but try to keep it within the usual tropes, right? Lizard, bat, just for yourself, just to make it easier. Some of you hardcore athletes that want to, take it up a notch, definitely be my guest. But the thing is, and this is what I say in the nice, Rick. This is what I'm saying in the instructional video as well. Is I see a lot of people when they want to design something, they look for reference and then they start designing, like the dragon, for instance, without fully understanding what their reference actually is constructed of, right? What those simple structures of that original animal is made up of. And if you cannot understand those simple shapes, it's very hard to then design something even more interesting and sometimes more complex than the original reference, right? And so that's what I really want you to focus on this week. And you guys saw the example in the lizard example that I put up on the instructional video, but it's going to be the same here for this cute little crocodile. So the first thing that you want to consider is, okay, what are the most rudimentary shapes that this crocodile consists of, right? And so if I look at it, it's that tapered box, right? It's a tapered box with a cylinder sitting on top. So, and all I have to do to figure out now is what's the perspective of that box and how does it sit in space, right? So, and if I look at it, it's a little bit of an up tilt. So it's probably looks a little bit like this. Right. And then we have that cylinder. I'll do that in another color. So that's basically the eye sockets. It's going to be even a little higher. Yeah, that's sitting on top like that. All right, so that's my most basic shape for this crocodile. And then you can argue that we have a cylinder shaping like this. So that's the first thing that you should figure out. Just the simple shapes, nothing more than this, just boxes and cylinders. Again, applying the knowledge of day one. What's being tapered? How do I taper my box? Some of you hardcore athletes might, bend it a little bit or twist it where needed, but keep it to the simple rudimentary shapes. And then what you're going to try and do is take a sip of water. Very important, don't get dehydrated. All right. And then what you're going to try and do and make the more organic shapes. And again, these organic shapes are also just, manipulated simple shapes. But because you now have your reference, you should try and, get it as close to the reference as possible. Now, this is where, of course, experience comes into play. A lot of you will have a hard time making these organic shapes. Some of you might have an easier time, okay? So if I look at this reference, the first thing that I'm thinking about, okay, those cylinders, they're more like 2 half spheres, right? Like this. Connected by a cylinder. And then another half sphere like this. Right, so already a little bit more organic. And then wedging in there is like a tapered, rounded box. with a sphere on top. Like I'm treating that snout, that frontal part of his snout, like or more like an inflated part of that box, right? And so this, comes down to that contour manipulation that I've been talking about. Right. Something like this. Maybe a little bit more. Like that. Okay. And then sitting behind them, if I zoom in, I'm just going to kind of explain you my thought process. Sitting behind his head, what I see is basically a flat, rounded, triangular box like this. So in my mind, that thing looks like this, right? And so that's what I'm drawing. Here as well. And then I'm just going to keep that. And the snout is even a little larger. Like that. Okay. Now let's just draw in the mouth. And the eye. And this top part of the box is a little bit more like bent, like what I showed you in the manipulation earlier. Right. And so that's the simple shapes that I'm now thinking of, which are a little bit more organic and a little bit more complex, of course, but they are following the same principles. They're just manipulated more, right? So they start looking more organic. And now the really cool thing about this is because I deconstruct this animal the way that I do from this reference photo, if you do this enough times, you can then learn to basically draw that animal from your memory in any angle that you want. Because those three parts that I just drew, I can now, if I want to, redraw them in a different angle. Just going to do this on another layer. In another perspective, I'm doing this in an exploded view, so you guys can understand what I'm sort of talking about. Right? So these pieces now fit together for me in a logical sense, and I can now manipulate them in any perspective that I want to. Right? So of course I'm saying if you do this enough, this will become easier and easier to do. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Any questions regarding this? All right. Everyone's so smart in here. Okay, moving on. Dragons, right? So, the thing with dragons now is, you've gone through day 1 and day 2, and basically, the idea for day 1 and day 2 is to help you guys understand how you can manipulate simple forms better, right? And I'm not doing the exercise of day 2 where you mannequinize the, a dragon design of choice, because that's different for everyone, and you can basically use the same principle as I just showed you with the crocodile. So the thing is now is you've increased your understanding of simple shapes, simple form, how to manipulate them, and now you're going to try and make your own dragon. Now, before you do that, before you do the thumbnailing and all that, I just want to quickly show you guys what most dragons are made up of, right? And this might help you in the mannequinization as well. This is definitely not a rule, but it does help a lot. And I'm going to do this in profile, just very, very simply. Most of you that are dragon fans, you know that there are multiple kinds of dragons. Not everything is actually a dragon. We have different categories. We have dragons, wyverns, amphiptyr or whatever, lindrums, drakes, rims, anything in between. Now, the cool thing is actually that most of these dragons are just a variation of these two, right? And actually, to be more specific, just this one. And what I mean by that is, if we look at a dragon in a profile view, the head is usually like a tapered box. Right? Most of the time, artists will simplify a dragon with a tapered box. And then the neck is just a cylinder. The shoulders, and this is open for discussion, this is different usually from dragon to dragon, but I like to use the animal, like quadruped animal mannequin that I've been showing in the Goat Week and the Horse Week as well. So basically a tapered, and I'm going to draw the front view, a tapered, rounded box like this, right? So that's the shoulder girdle part of the dragon, right? And then the neck sits more like this. And then we have another bent cylinder, like this. And then again, following that analogy that I've been talking about, the mannequinization of quadrupeds, we have the box that basically encompasses the hip part of the dragon or the animal. And then we have the femur, which is represented, or the upper leg, it's called the femur. And then we have the tibia and the fibula, also represented by a cylinder. And then we have the feet. And then for the shoulder part, we have the humerus, the radius and the ulna, and then the claws or the hands. And by now, your dragon should look like a very weird dog, right? And then we continue with the tail, which is usually like a 50-50 division. So we have 50% dragon body and then 50% tail, but you can vastly exaggerate this. Like I like to use a 1/3 to 2/3 principle, where 2/3 of the dragon is tail and then 1/3 is body. Yeah, the Dogo dragon. Okay, and then lastly are the wings, of course. And this is where you should study bat wings as well. But essentially, wings are exactly the same as our arms. And for those of you that have studied anatomy enough, you'll understand this. So basically, the wing is also a humerus bone, and then a radius and ulna bone, which is basically represented by a tapered cylinder. Yeah, I'm drawing this orthographically. Make him a little smaller. And then we have the wrist bones actually over here that are small, like bones, and they go into the hands. And so there's one of two things. You either have 5, which I basically the finger bones, you either have 5 of them in the wings, or you have the thumb separately, which I like to do a lot. So, your thumb would be here, represented by like a claw, and then you would have 4 finger bones, basically, that make up the wings. Right. I'm guessing most of you knew that, but I still want you to study bat wings, regardless. Okay, so now why am I saying that the dragon is basically the reference point for all these other dragons is if I'm going to scale them down just a little bit more. If I duplicate this guy and I take away his forearms, boom, wyvern, right? Just like that. If I undo that and I take away his wings and I change his proportions a little bit, I have a drake, right? Or a lintworm. No, a drake. And if I then take away the rears, I have a lintworm. If I take away everything, I have a worm or rim. And if I delete everything and except for the wings, I have this guy, right? So basically, it's just an alternative of the dragon. All right. Now let's put this guy to the side. And now, once you know the mannequin a little bit, the tapered box, the cylinder for the body, the mannequinization for a quadruped for the body itself, the tail, just a tapered cylinder, and the wings, you can start designing your dragon. Now, of course, most of the time when I design a dragon, I'm not first mannequinizing it. But that's just what I want you guys to do this week, just to, again, increase your understanding. It's, you have to start somewhere, and you're not going to make the coolest design starting off with a mannequin. That's usually why we do thumbnails. It's the thumbnails where we can, put in gesture, sometimes rely on happy accidents to come up with cool silhouettes, come up with interesting shapes. And I definitely encourage you to do that in day 3. But if you want to start designing your dragon first with just simple manipulated mannequin shapes, I would highly advise that you do that just to increase your understanding of how you can build up this dragon. Because when I have a thumbnail and I want to solidify it, let's say, just that simple thumbnail that you saw in the instructional video, I'm still thinking about those simple shapes underneath. I just have enough experience to just instantly start with a more detailed, organic looking stage because I've done this so much. And when I look at a reference, I understand its complex shapes, and now I can manipulate those shapes into my own design, right? And that's what I'm trying to bring to you guys this week, or help you understand at least. So for instance, if you just want to draw a dragon head this week, which is already more than challenging, what you could do is maybe try to come up with an interesting like pose or perspective for that dragon. Maybe something like this, so it's looking away from us, and then its neck is maybe coming towards us. Something like this, maybe, to start off with. Like a very simple shape, and then of course 2 simple horns like that. This could be the start of your dragon. And now the thing is, and that's why I want you to put so much emphasis on the manipulation number 2 of day 1 of this week, is because now you can make more interesting shapes. For instance, you can make this neck already interesting just by making, because now the contour is just a cylinder, right? Or an ellipse. What if we make it something that's like this on top, but then maybe curves in towards the bottom, right? So what would that look like? Well, it might look more like this. So let's follow that contour. So that could already make your dragon look cooler. And then thinking about that center line that runs across its back, you can add your horns or whatever detailing you want to make him start looking more interesting. And then instead of maybe having the eyes over here, we push him to here a little bit. Right, and maybe he has big feet like that. Right. And so that could be the start of your dragon. And then you can go in and maybe add those more organic shapes, right? The things that you've learned from your animal of day 2, right? I can still add like my crocodile sort of simple, or more complex shape that I've been studying, but change the proportions a little bit. Maybe he has like a chin horn going on as well. Right, something like this. Maybe there's some horns, like on this contour, maybe there's some horns here as well. So we can add horns like that. Just following that contour, very simple. And we can add more horns. You know. And once you understand those simple shapes, you can basically start manipulating whatever you want. Of course, it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of, you know, just having drawn these animals. Maybe we can add some fish elements in here. So this is the cool thing about design, you know, this is where you should start having fun. You know, this is like maybe the back of like a sea bass. I'm not sure if you've seen that animal before, right? But this is what you could maybe add to the design as well, you know? Just start having fun with it. But as you can see, it's definitely not easy to do. And it definitely takes a lot of practice. But if you start understanding how you can manipulate simple geometry into more complex geometry and then apply that complex geometry to a mannequin that you've invented or you've studied from other artists, right? So what you could do this week is the artist that you study in day 2, you know, the pose of the dragon, the perspective of the dragon, even the proportions of the dragon, you could take that mannequin and then copy it into day 3, but maybe design it completely differently with the organic manipulated shapes that you've learned from your animal that you've studied, right? Because maybe the dragon that you're referencing is, I don't know, looks like a crocodile, but the animal that you've been learning from is like a dragon lizard or, you know, a rattlesnake or, you know, anything goes, right? And so you could apply that to that mannequin that you've studied in day 2 and see what you can come up with, right? Of course, hardcore art leads, I definitely encourage you to do the thumbnails as well, so you can just see what kind of silhouettes you can come up with, and because this is going to be pivotal when you become a concept artist in the industry, they're going to want to see thumbnails, right? And those thumbnails need to illustrate the point of the design already. They need to look like dragons, they need to look cool, they need to have cool shapes, but it's just silhouettes. And then based on those silhouettes, you can solidify them, create more anatomy for them, you know, make them more interesting. But yeah, that's all I wanted to share today in this classroom. I'm not sure if you guys have any questions or something that you want to know. I like that you're drawing along. All right. Could you maybe show us a little example of how you go through the thumbnailing process? Okay, Lex, just for you. So if I were to thumbnail dragons, I would take a brush that is a little less opaque, so there's little room for opacity. And, you know, I would just start thinking about, primarily with dragons, I would first think just about silhouette, you know, and gesture. Like, how can I make maybe more like a whimsical dragon, for instance? You know, something that has like a lot of gesture. I'm just gonna move this thumbnail. And then the tail, like I was saying, like 2/3 of it, like two-thirds of its body would be like the tail. You know, something like that. Maybe he has stompy arms. Like this. Suggest a little bit of perspective with the horns. It's always fun to do. And then you go from, you know, what's it? Primary shapes to secondary shapes where you know, fiddle with the silhouette a little bit more. Maybe add like a tongue, horns, you know, whatever you see fit. You know, something like that. Or if I were to draw a more bulky dragon. And this is the thing, right? If you have like what are those things called that you, what's that movie with the robot versus the monsters? Kaizu dragons? Yeah, Pacific Rim, right? So it's the same setup, basically. But you would just bulk up your dragon significantly, right? So instead of it just having normal legs, you would seriously bulk that up, right? Now you would be drawing a bulky character, or, you know, think about elephant paws or whatever, you know. Right, something like this. That's more like an alien dragon. you get the idea, right? Kaiju, yeah, thank you. So this is how I would go about thumbnailing, right? If it needs to be a bulky dragon, it could be like this. If it needs to be more like maybe an insect dragon, again, I start with the head. Go to the tail. But now we make him insect wings. But it's still a dragon, right? So horns, maybe an open mouth if you want to. Maybe like a scorpion tail. You can do whatever with dragons, man. Just have fun with it. Dragon design is the most fun to do, by far. Depends. If you want to just start off with something that you're comfortable with, legs, in terms of preferring side view versus anything else, thumbnailing should be, this is where you need to invent first and foremost. So it is stressful on your mind, but just start with something that you're comfortable with. If that's a side view, like from the mannequin view that I showed you, and then you start manipulating that, sure, do that first. But then you'll come in sort of a flow state where you'll be more comfortable designing dragons in a 3/4 view or, a back view, or just let the thumbnail process take you where you want to go, right? That's the cool thing about thumbnailing. It's actually thumbnailing. That's why they, why you hear in a lot of concept art videos or art talks or whatever, is that thumbnailing, you need to go past that stage of more than 12 thumbnails. The reason you need to do that is because your first few thumbnails will be super generic, right? Or they will be in a boring view, or the shapes won't be interesting, and that's why you need to get past that, and then you get into that flow state. So thumbnailing is basically enforcing that flow state. And once you're in that flow state, you come up with a lot more interesting designs. All right. Cool. Any other questions? Gabriel, would you gather reference before or after the thumbnailing process? When it's a subject that I'm fairly familiar with, Gabriel, it's always after the thumbnailing process. I like to have my thumbnails not be influenced too much by real life things, because otherwise I notice that I get influenced by the reference, which shouldn't happen. I don't want to get influenced by the reference. I want to get inspired by reference, but I don't want to get influenced by real life reference, because then you start creating restrictions, right? So usually in the thumbnailing process, if I'm familiar with the subject, I'll start thumbnailing without reference, just coming up with cool shapes, and then I'll use reference to solidify it. But sometimes, of course, if it's an unfamiliar territory, or it's something very weird or something I'm not familiar with, then I'll definitely use reference beforehand. How do you come up with interesting shapes for your thumbnails or designs? Well, Tim, that's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? It's very personal. That's the thing with design. It cannot be taught, theoretically, because interesting shapes are very personal, and there are definitely design rules, like big, medium, small shapes, areas of rest versus areas of detail, proportions, a lot of these things, like avoid symmetry, have flow in your designs, things that flow through the design, and gesture. These are all things that help your design, but it's not something that you can put into a template. So coming up with interesting shapes, I would say, comes from having studied a lot of other artists, looking at, real life, because real life has really cool shapes. Think of, fish or flowers or organic shapes. And it's just an amalgamation of those things that you can retain into your memory and then, put on paper. Cool. Well, if those are all the questions for today, I'm going to leave you guys at it. This has been recorded, so I will be putting it up on the website as soon as I can. I thank you all for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was useful. And I'll see you in the next one.